Hey, what's up? This is Jared with Ditch Auto, and today we have the Sony a6400 here, and we're going to talk about how to set it up to do interval shooting or to create a time lapse within the camera. So with the a6400, Sony brought a internal counter or timer or whatever you want to call it, the intravolometer, but now it's internal in the camera, which means we don't need any external devices in order to do a time lapse. And Sony is rolling this out and has rolled it out to a lot of other cameras already. So we're going to talk about setting up a time lapse and what you need to do with your camera in order to make sure that you get a nice looking time lapse. And then in a future video, we'll take our time lapse that we shoot into a video editor so that we can create a nice time lapse, a nice looking time lapse from the content that we created. So the way that you want to set up your camera depends on the type of time lapse that you want to shoot. Of course, we're going to go into the settings and we're going to talk about the camera settings that are involved in doing a time lapse with the a6400. But you also need to be thinking about the lens that you're going to use when doing a time lapse. You could do really cool time lapses with wide lenses and more telephoto lenses. It just really depends on what you're trying to achieve and the look of the time lapse. So for example, if you're wanting to go more like with a landscape view, maybe you want some of your foreground available in the shot and sky, and just to see a lot, like a very expansive view, you're going to want to do a time lapse with a wider angle lens. Now, the thing about using a wider angle lens is if you have your camera on some sort of a slider or something that's going to move, the wider angle lens and the time lapse will make the movement look less, like less movement is happening unless the camera is really moving. So the wider angle that you go with the time lapse, it can look like less is moving. If you go with more of a zoom lens, it looks like more is moving because, of course, as you zoom in more, your angle of view gets much more narrow, and or your width of view gets much more narrow, and then movement is going to move a lot faster through that. So you really have to kind of think about, what you're wanting to do with that time lapse, how you want it to look, the same way that you would if you were going to shoot a photo and you'd choose to shoot really wide versus very narrow. The best thing to do is just to really kind of play with it, try it, and see what the effect looks like after you're done. On this Sony a6400, I have an 85mm lens, and I would use this type of lens if I was trying to kind of get something that's a little bit further away, obviously, but also make the movement look more drastic. Because a lot of times when I'm doing time lapses, I do have my camera on some sort of a slider or something that shows movement. But you really can use any lens when doing a time lapse, and you can set it up any way that you want. I just think that it's important to talk about lens and focal length because you can make a time lapse feel a lot different depending on how that's set up. So being done talking about lenses now, other things that you want to consider before getting into the settings and doing your time lapse is making sure that you have a fully charged battery. If you're going to do a time lapse over a long period of time, you're going to need to make sure that you have a well-charged battery because your camera is going to be powered on for quite a bit of time. So the battery that's in there, you want to make sure that that is good to go. And if it's a really long time lapse, you might actually consider plugging power into the side of your camera. Your camera came with a cable and a little charging adapter. You could plug that into power, plug it right into the side of your camera. If you don't have AC power or like a wall jack near you where you can plug in, high voltage power into the camera using that adapter, then of course you could plug it into some sort of a battery bank or whatnot. I've got a link to the battery bank that I use down below, and it powers a Sony camera for quite some time. All right, so now we're going to jump into those camera settings. We're going to turn on our camera here and go into the menu. So in the menu on the first tab here, on the third page of that tab, we're going to go down to the bottom where it says interval shoot function. Now, if you're not on the a6400 and you don't have this option, or it could also be on another page here, you might need to do a firmware update on your camera still. But all a6400s from the factory come with this version and this option. So you're going to want to turn on interval shooting, otherwise the interval shooting function is not going to be available when you are ready to go and shoot. You're also going to need to do a shoot start time. So what this does is it allows you to hit the shutter button to start the interval shooting, and then there's a countdown timer before it starts. I recommend setting this to at least 10 seconds, so that way when you hit the shutter button, and if you're on a tripod or something and the camera just moves a little bit because you push down, the first shot of your time lapse isn't going to be off from the rest of them. So I usually set like a 10-second or maybe even a little bit longer, depending on, if I need to make sure that I get out of the shot or something like that, or I want a little bit of a delay before the shot starts. You could set that shooting time, and you can set that like, up to 99 minutes, and that's kind of a crazy lead-in time, but nonetheless, you can set that. Then your shooting interval, you can set, and this is going to change the overall length and the number of shots that you're going to need to get to that length. So for example, if you're shooting 1 second, it's going to take a photo every second. And as you move this up to, say, 5 seconds, it'll take a photo every 5 seconds. Now, the tricky thing about having it shoot at, say, 1 second is if you're doing a time lapse at night and you're going to require a long shutter speed. So for example, your shutter speed is going to have to stay open for at least a second, or I would say even a little more than a half a second. You might want to make some changes to the way that you have your camera set up, because if your shutter stays opened longer than the time that it takes for the shooting interval, then you're going to have a problem there. This sounds a little confusing, and I'm trying to do my best to describe this, but your camera has to be able to take the picture and then be ready to take a picture again before the interval is up. So you have to make sure that your shutter speed isn't so long that that process combined with the saving of the image doesn't result in some sort of an issue. When you're shooting in manual mode, you only have you have to fit all that within a certain time frame. When you're shooting in like an automatic mode or something like that, and there's a feature that I'll talk about on the last page here. But nonetheless, you just want to make sure that you don't have any overlapping there. Usually the camera does a pretty good job of still like saving the image in the background, but in my practices, over a long period of time, you just want to make sure that the camera is done thinking by the time it's ready to take the next photo. So shooting interval also 1 second to 5 seconds. If you have a longer shooting interval, more things can happen in the amount of time between those two photos. So I usually go with a longer shooting interval if I want the time lapse to take place over a longer period of time. For example, if you're doing a time lapse and you really want to see the sky racing by fast, you might want a little bit longer of a shooting interval, like 3 to 5 seconds. And that really depends on how fast the sky is moving and how, if you've got clouds and stuff in the sky, how fast they're moving. Some days the clouds don't move very fast. Other days they're zipping by. So depending on how much movement you want, if you want people or cars or, something moving through your shot, you are going to want a little bit faster of an interval, like 1 or 2 seconds. If you do 3 or 5 seconds, chances are you might get, it's going to be very jerky looking time lapse, because a person may enter the frame in one shot and they're gone in the next shot with a new person, maybe mid frame or something like that. And so the time lapse itself is going to be very kind of jerky, and it isn't going to flow really well. So think about what you're shooting also when you decide your shooting interval. And it's fun just to test here, just to try it out and to see what works best for what you're doing. The more that you practice with this and go in and just kind of try different things, the better you're going to get at it. So I'm going to go ahead and just set our shooting interval at 1 second. And then number of shots, I have it set at 100. And you can see here at a shooting interval at 1 second, our shooting time is going to be 1 minute and 39 seconds. So if I increase this to 200 shots, it increases our shooting time. So this is where you're going to set up how long your time lapse is going to be. So if you're wanting a 5-minute long time lapse, you're going to need 301 photos. Now, the reason that you're going to need it set up this way is because of the shooting interval. And when you go and take your images and put them into a timeline in a video editor so that you can make your time lapse, you need to take into account how many images you're going to need based on the amount of frames or your frame rate of your project. So for example, if you're going for like the typical like cinematic standard of 24 frames per second, you're going to need 24 images per second. That's how fast everything is going to fly by. If you're going with like a 30, you're going to need a lot more images. And so you're definitely going to want to take that into account as well. My best practice though for time lapses is to shoot at 24 frames per second. All right, so AE sensitivity tracking has to do with your auto exposure tracking. Now, this is important because when you are shooting a time lapse, especially in the examples that I gave where there's cloud cover and your exposure is going to change because the sun gets blocked a little bit, you want the camera to naturally react a little bit to the changes in exposure. And so you don't want those hard, abrupt shifts in exposure that you see in some time lapses where it's not a smooth experience. It's not really fun to watch because the exposure jumps so harshly between a bright and a dark scene, because the time lapse means more time is lapsing in between each shot, and because of that, the exposure has more of a chance to change than it would in maybe say a video where you're seeing the brightness values of the sky or whatever it is change in a natural way. So the adding of this feature allows your camera to adapt a little bit and kind of make up for the fact that there are going to be some exposure changes, and you can set the sensitivity that you want the camera to have there. So depending on your scene and how much change in exposure you anticipate, you might want to set this sensitivity accordingly. I do recommend testing it and giving it a try. If you're going to be shooting with your camera in full manual mode like I am, then the sensitivity option isn't going to be doing as much work as the camera would be doing naturally if you were in an automatic mode where the camera is actually changing its exposure as well. So keep that in mind, and depending on how you're going to be using your camera, make your settings and adjust your settings accordingly. So I wanted to talk a little bit about autofocus as well. Autofocus is something that is important to take into account with a time lapse, because if every photo that you take, your camera is getting focus from a different point, it's going to be really hard to watch that time lapse. It's almost going to be jarring, a jarring experience to watch that time lapse. So I recommend when you are shooting a time lapse that you either make sure that the point of interest is going to stay in place so the camera doesn't have to fight too hard to try and find and decide what it's going to focus on, or you choose just to shoot in manual focus altogether, making sure that the camera doesn't do any focus searching, and so every photo is super consistent. This is going to vary based on what you're shooting. If you're shooting landscape or something like that, like in my examples, I can easily put it in manual focus and leave it alone because nothing in the shot is changing. But if you do have something moving and you want maybe, say, people walking through the shot, and you want each of those people to be in focus as they walk through, some people may be a little closer to the camera, some people may be a little bit further, and so you might want some sort of adjustment there depending on the look and the feel that you're going for. So this is another thing that you're going to want to play with and shoot a time lapse. Let your camera do what it's going to do, maybe go in manual focus and set a specific point of focus that you could guess as being the best point of focus. That's where time lapses are set apart from each other. Really good time lapses have a good focus point where most of the area that you want your eye drawn to in the time lapse is, of course, in focus. And so you're going to want to play with that a little bit and practice, because practice makes perfect, and it makes you more able to be responsive to setting up the appropriate shot and getting the appropriate exposure, focus, and all of those things together in one package to make for a great time lapse. So silent shooting in interval, I have that set to on, so that way the camera is not making a noise every time it takes a photo. It's in silent shooting mode. I think that that's a better option, not only because it doesn't make a bunch of noise, and it's not just going to be making noise every second or every couple of seconds every time it takes a photo, but it also introduces camera shake and stuff like that. Maybe very little. We're nitpicking at that point, but I think silent shooting is just a better option. And then there is one option grayed out right here, which is shoot interval priority. I was mentioning this earlier. If you are in, say, P mode, or if you're in automatic mode on the camera, and it lengthens the shutter speed to over the interval that your camera is shooting at, it changes the priority there, and so you can set that appropriately, or if you want to turn that off, you could turn it off. So that does it for the actual settings in the camera itself. There are a couple more things that we need to talk about. So let's briefly talk about actual camera shooting settings. You can see here that I'm kind of in like a photo mode of 1 to 200th of a second at f2.0 and ISO of 200. You can see now, because we have our interval shooting mode turned on, that we have 1 second there and 0 out of 301 images. So that way we have a representation on the back of the camera as to how many images are going to be shot. Now, your camera is going to take photos based on the settings that your camera is set up with. So I have, I'm shooting in RAW plus JPEG. So if I go over to the first panel here, you can see I'm shooting RAW plus JPEG in fine. Now, the reason that I'm shooting RAW plus JPEG is because I'm shooting these images raw, so I can actually take my entire raw image sequence into Lightroom and make edits to my images just like I would my normal photos, and then export all of those as JPEGs, and then take those JPEGs into the video editor and make my video. That means I'll be able to make really dynamic looking time lapses, because I can edit my time lapse, basically my time lapse video, in the same way that I would edit my photos, which gives me a lot more flexibility. So I recommend shooting in RAW, especially if you have some experience shooting and editing photos in RAW. Your camera settings here are going to depend on your scene, of course. Just as you would with any photo that you're taking, you would make adjustments to your camera settings. Now, if your camera is going to be moving during the time lapse, you want to make sure to take into account that if you have your shutter speed set to slow, which means the shutter is open for a longer period of time, there could be some blur that is introduced because the camera is moving. So if your camera is fixed and things aren't really moving too quickly through your shot, then you could, of course, bring that shutter speed down, to let more light in, maybe even take it down to like 1/50th or 1/40th of a second. Because if you think about it, you're kind of shooting a movie in a sense, and so you could bring the shutter speed down a bit, and a little bit of blur is going to feel okay. But most of the time in time lapses, they're a little bit more sharp, because it is a series of photos, and so you're going to want to keep your shutter speed up high enough to freeze whatever action is in that going on in that time lapse. So for example, if people are walking across the frame, you want to make sure that they are relatively sharp. They don't need to be overly sharp. A little bit of motion blur is going to be okay. So normally, if I was taking a photo of somebody walking through the frame, I might bring my shutter speed up to 1/160th or 1/200th of a second to freeze them in the frame. But because we're doing a time lapse, a little bit of blur is okay, so we could take that down even to 1/80th of a second. That's going to be nice, because in lower light situations, it'll let more light into our sensor. Then we have our f-stop, of course. If our f-stop is set too wide, so like for example f2.0 on this lens, it's going to be a shallower depth of field. So we'll have that cool focus fall off in the background of our image, beautiful bokeh and all that stuff, but a lot of things in the background are not going to be in focus. So if we want things to be in focus, we're going to have to bring that shutter speed up. If I want things in focus in the background, I'm up to at least f6.3, but keep in mind that's also going to decrease the amount of light that is hitting the sensor of your camera. Now, because we are shooting photos and not video, we could get away with bringing our ISO up a bit higher. You could bring your ISO up safely, probably to around 3200, maybe even up to 6400, and not even have to worry about noise reduction on your images. But if you do need to bring it up, say even to maybe 10,000, remember that if you're shooting in RAW and you're shooting these images, you can take them into Lightroom, you can apply noise reduction, and of course bring back a little bit of that image that may have gotten a little bit noisy. So I don't want to talk too much in length about individual camera shooting settings. That wasn't necessarily the point of this video. The purpose of this video was to help you better understand the interval shooting function of the Sony a6400. I hope this video helped you out. Make sure to give it a thumbs up if it did. Subscribe to the channel here because we're going to be talking a bit more about time lapses, and I hope that you'll join us. So click that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.